Dungeons and Dragons, a name synonymous with fantasy, funny-shaped dice, and that one really terrible film. But what actually is D&D and why should you be playing it?
DD5.
Dungeons and Dragons is the world's most popular and successful tabletop role-playing game. Created by Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson in 1974 as a derivative of the miniature medieval wargame Chainmail. It has since gone on to become one of the foremost influences of countless fantasy and sci-fi novels, video games, and movies. D&D is a storytelling adventure game, generally played with a group of friends around a table with nothing but a writing utensil, some paper, some dice, a few core rulebooks, and your imagination. Unlike other types of games that focus on skill, logic, or luck in order to attain a goal and win, Dungeons & Dragons, as a tabletop RPG, is a game where a group of players assume the roles of fictional characters who embark upon imaginary adventures exploring dungeons, fighting monsters, and discovering treasure within a fantasy setting. It is a collaborative storytelling game in which there is no preset win condition. Instead, it is the exploration of the fictional world and the telling of the story that is the goal. All of this is a fancy way of saying that D&D is essentially a game of make-believe, albeit a structured game of make-believe with written rules. So how do you play? A D&D group is made up of two basic roles, the players and the dungeon master. Let's start with the players. Each player creates and controls a single character, which represents an individual in the world. When creating a character, a player will typically first choose that character's race, such as an elf, dwarf, or human. In this case, race could be more aptly described as species. Each playable race will have unique features and attributes that help define them. Next, a player will choose a class for their character such as fighter, wizard, or rogue. A class could also be seen as an occupation or profession. It is what you essentially do as a character and defines much of your major abilities, such as casting spells or fighting with weapons. Depending on the edition you're playing, there will be various ability scores and skills to be allocated to finish rounding out what your character can do. Once this is done, the player will decide a name for their character and a backstory to give them a personality. This can be as simple or complex as the player wants. Maybe you want to be a noble but flawed warrior who has become battle-scarred defending their homeland from evil for most of their life, and now seeks some outside hope to save their failing kingdom. Or you might just rather simply be a thieving rogue looking to get rich by delving into ancient dungeons. It's up to you, whatever sounds the most fun. So now your character and backstory is decided, and your character sheet is all filled out. You are now ready for your adventure. Or are you? First, one member of the group must assume the role of the Dungeon Master. The Dungeon Master, or DM, plays a much different role from the players. While the players are actors responsible for the actions of a single character, the Dungeon Master serves as an author, director, and referee of the game. The world and everyone in it that the characters interact with is controlled by the DM. That's everything from threatening monsters and traps to the surrounding environment and the events taking place within it. Though this often places the DM opposite to the players, it does not mean that the DM is the enemy of the players. In fact, it's quite the opposite. The Dungeon Master is responsible for the game's narrative flow, creating the scenario and setting in which the game takes place, maintaining the pace, and providing dynamic feedback. It's all about telling a story together, one in which the players are engaged and challenged, while facilitating the development of interesting choices and events. The Dungeon Master is not trying to kill your character, despite what the dice may lead you to believe. Speaking of dice, when do they come into play? Most actions a player may want to have their character make can be resolved by simply stating an action through roleplay. You want to ask the barkeeper some questions? Sure, what do you ask him? Some actions, though, require the roll of a die to determine the character's success or failure. Feats of athleticism, diplomacy, or magical knowledge may require what is called a skill check, and attacking an enemy likely will require what is called an attack roll. In most cases, you'll be rolling a d20, or 20-sided die, and adding the relevant number from your character sheet to determine if you succeed or fail at your endeavor. The other dice used in D&D, the d4, d6, d8, d10, and d12 are usually reserved for calculating the damage of attacks, though there are some exceptions. All in all, if there's an action you wish to take as a player, there is likely a rule and a dice roll that can make it happen. And if there isn't, just make it up. That's what DMs are for. So, do you wish to venture forth into the great unknown in search of treasure and adventure? Does the idea of slaying a legendary monstrosity and becoming a hero appeal to you as time well spent? Do you like the idea of hanging out with friends and telling the greatest stories you'll ever hear together around a table covered in dice, paper, and snacks? Then you should be playing Dungeons and Dragons. If you enjoyed this video and want to know more about the fantastic world of Dungeons and Dragons, then check out our main podcast, The Dungeon Cast, where we dive into the detailed lore and gameplay of all things D&D.